It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels unnatural. Wrong. 2 children, bright and full of life, vanished without a trace. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, sharp-witted and protective, and 7-year-old JJ Vallow, a boy with special needs who loved hugs and superheroes. For months, their mother, Lori Vallow Daybell, insisted they were fine, off somewhere safe. But deep down, everyone around her felt the same creeping dread. Something unspeakable had happened. That silence would end in the most horrifying way imaginable. When investigators dug into a shallow grave behind the home of Lori's new husband, Chad Daybell, what they uncovered was not just the remains of 2 children, but the monstrous depths of obsession, delusion, and evil. This is the story of the so-called Doomsday Mother, a woman whose apocalyptic visions, narcissism, and hunger for control destroyed her own family. September 2019, Rexburg, Idaho, a quiet college town. Neatly trimmed lawns, modest homes, the kind of place where people waved to neighbors and left their doors unlocked. No one could imagine the sinister story about to unfold in their midst. At the center of it all was Lori Vallow Daybell, 46 years old. To the outside world, Lori seemed almost magnetic. Tall, blonde, strikingly beautiful. A former beauty pageant contestant with a megawatt smile, she carried herself with confidence, even charm. But behind that polished exterior, Lori's mind was descending into darkness. She believed she was chosen by God, that she could speak to angels, that she and her new lover, a fringe author named Chad Daybell, were destined to lead a select few into the end times. And standing in the way of this divine mission were her own children, Tylee and JJ Tylee Ryan. Just 16 was Lori's only daughter from a previous marriage. Independent, sarcastic, and protective of her younger brother, she dreamed of a normal life despite her family's chaos. Friends remembered her as witty and sharp, the kind of teenager who could make you laugh even on the darkest days. JJ Vallow, only 7, had been adopted by Lori and her then-husband Charles. Diagnosed with autism, JJ needed extra care and patience. He loved hugs, his service dog, and the simple joys of being a kid, cartoons, playtime, family. To those who loved him, JJ was pure innocence. But to Lori, increasingly consumed by Chad's bizarre teachings, her children were no longer children. They were obstacles. Worse, in her twisted belief system, they were zombies. By late summer 2019, Lori's world had completely shifted. She had left behind her old life, her ex-husband, and her obligations. With Chad by her side, she became obsessed with the idea that the end of the world was imminent, and that she was one of the chosen leaders. For Lori, everything and everyone was now divided into 2 categories, light or dark. Good spirits or evil zombies. Her own children, Tylee and JJ, she began labeling as dark. On September 8, 2019, the last known photo of Tylee was taken at Yellowstone National Park. She stood smiling, next to JJ and her uncle Alex Cox. But what no one knew then was that it was the last time anyone would see her alive. Days later, Tylee was gone. Her body, dismembered and burned, would eventually be discovered buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. For JJ, the nightmare unfolded later that same month. On September 23, 2019, he was last seen at school. By the next morning, Lori claimed she was homeschooling him. Soon after, JJ too vanished. His remains were later found in a shallow grave bound with duct tape, stuffed into garbage bags. The brutality was staggering. The indifference chilling. And through it all, Lori carried on, smiling at friends, dancing at pool parties, telling anyone who asked that her kids were safe and happy. At first, the children's disappearance raised quiet concern. Relatives began asking questions. Where were Tylee and JJ? Why hadn't they been heard from? By November, those concerns turned into suspicion. Police conducted welfare checks. Lori brushed them off with rehearsed excuses. The kids were with friends. They were with family. They were fine, but investigators weren't convinced. Then came the bombshell. Lori and Chad had suddenly married, just weeks after Chad's previous wife. Tammy Daybell had mysteriously died in her sleep. The pattern was undeniable. Spouses, children, anyone who stood in their way seemed to disappear. Authorities launched a nationwide search for the children. Lori and Chad became the focus of relentless media attention. But instead of cooperating, they vanished. fleeing to Hawaii, smiling and carefree while the world demanded to know, where are the kids? For months, the mystery deepened. Investigators combed through phone records, financial transactions, digital data. Every clue pointed to one horrifying truth: the children were gone. Finally, on June 9, 2020, FBI agents and local police descended on Chad Daybell's property. With shovels and heavy equipment, they began to dig. Hours later, their worst fears were confirmed. The remains of JJ and Tylee were uncovered in shallow graves, buried like trash, mere steps from where Chad's family had once gathered for barbecues. The discovery shattered even the most seasoned investigators. One agent described it simply: the smell of death hung in the air. The trials of Lori and Chad became a media spectacle, yet in the courtroom, the horror was laid bare with raw, unflinching detail. Prosecutors painted Lori as a manipulative narcissist, a woman so consumed by her cult beliefs and obsession with Chad that she willingly sacrificed her own children. They read Lori's texts aloud. In one chilling message, she referred to JJ as acting like a zombie. In another, she and Chad discussed removing obstacles. When asked about her children's whereabouts, Lori showed no grief, no sorrow, only defiance. The families of Tylee and JJ sat in the courtroom, forced to relive their loss through graphic evidence in cold, calculated words. In one victim impact statement, JJ's grandparents wept as they described the boy's laughter, his hugs, the way he lit up a room. He deserved love. He deserved life. Instead, he got betrayal from the one person who should have protected him the most, and Lori, she sat there, at times smirking, at times staring blankly ahead, as if she were above it all. In May 2023, Lori was convicted of the murders of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought a measure of justice, but no true peace. For the families, the scars will never heal. Tylee's dreams of adulthood, of independence, were stolen. JJ's innocence, his need for love and safety, was betrayed in the cruelest way. Chad Daybell still awaits his trial, facing charges that could bring the death penalty. As for Lori, she remains behind bars, forever remembered not as a beauty queen or loving mother, but as the doomsday mom who sacrificed her children to a twisted fantasy. The community of Rexburg still struggles with the aftermath. Neighbors drive past the Daybell property, haunted by the knowledge of what lies beneath the soil. Parents hold their children tighter, aware that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, it charms, it convinces you it's chosen by God. And if you thought Lori Vallow Daybell's story was the darkest it could get, the next case will drag you even deeper into the shadows. Let's dive in. When firefighters arrived that October night in Lawrenceville, Georgia, the smell hit them first, an acrid, suffocating mix of burned plastic and something far more sinister. They found a trash can, blackened by flames, sitting outside a quiet apartment complex. But inside that can wasn't garbage. It was the small, charred body of a 10-year-old girl. Her name was Imani Moss. She weighed only 32 pounds at the time of her death. Her fragile frame starved until she was little, more than bone and skin. And the person responsible for this unimaginable cruelty wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was the woman who lived in her home, who should have cared for her, who should have protected her, her stepmother, Tiffany Moss. What followed was one of the most disturbing child abuse cases Georgia had ever seen. A case that revealed not only the depths of cruelty one woman was capable of, but also the unbearable silence of a child whose voice was never heard until it was too late. October 2013, Lawrenceville, Georgia. Lawrenceville is an ordinary suburb. Apartment buildings sit side by side, children ride bikes, families grill food on small balconies. On the surface, it's a place of safety. But in one of those modest apartments behind drawn curtains, a nightmare was unfolding. Tiffany Moss, a woman in her early 30s, looked ordinary to neighbors. African American, average height, often quiet, rarely drawing attention. She was a stepmother to 3 children, married to Emin Moss, a man who worked long hours trying to support his family. But Tiffany carried with her a deep well of bitterness. Years earlier, she had been convicted of abusing her stepdaughter, Imani. That conviction had cost Tiffany a job, and in her mind it was Imani's fault. She hated the girl, Not because of anything the child had done, but because Tiffany saw her as the source of her own failures. Psychologists later described Tiffany as cold, resentful, indifferent. But there was more. Vengeful. She wanted to punish Imani, to erase her. Imani Gabrielle Moss, just 10 years old. Born into a life already marked by instability. Her biological mother had lost custody years earlier, leaving her father, Emin, and Tiffany to raise her. But despite that troubled start, Imani had light inside her. She loved to draw. Teachers described her as quiet but sweet, eager to please and grateful for small kindnesses. She wanted to fit in. She wanted to be loved, but in her own home, love was absent. What she received instead was silence, neglect, and cruelty. The abuse didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, like a storm gathering strength. Imani was isolated, locked away in her bedroom for days, sometimes weeks, denied food, denied care, denied the basic tenderness every child deserves. Neighbors occasionally saw her, but rarely. When they did, she looked thin, withdrawn. Teachers had raised concerns before, but somehow the system kept letting her slip through. By the fall of 2013, Imani's body had wasted away. On the night of October 24th, her stepmother finally carried out the last act of cruelty. Tiffany locked Imani in her room without food. The girl, weak, malnourished, barely able to move, fought silently for survival. She cried, but no one came. She called out, but no one answered, and then silence. By the morning of October 25th, Imani was gone. Her small body, weighing only 32 pounds, lay lifeless in that room. But Tiffany wasn't finished. Instead of grief, she turned to destruction. She convinced Emin, the father, to help dispose of the body. Together, they stuffed Imani into a trash can, poured gasoline over her fragile remains, and set it on fire. When the flames didn't fully consume her, the horror became undeniable. The body of a child, scorched and broken, lay among melted plastic. At first, the story Tiffany and Emin told was shaky. It began when Emin himself, racked with guilt, called 911. He confessed that his daughter was dead, that his wife had starved her. Police and firefighters rushed to the apartment, only to find the smoldering trash can in the courtyard. Inside were the remains of little Imani. Investigators later said the scene was something they would never forget. The stench of gasoline, the charred fragments of a body that should have been running. Laughing, playing, neighbors were horrified. Many admitted they hadn't even realized the girl was missing. She had been kept so hidden, her suffering so silent, that her death came as a brutal shock. As detectives pieced together the timeline, the truth was unavoidable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of anger gone too far. It was deliberate, planned, sustained cruelty, carried out over weeks and months until the child's body simply couldn't hold on any longer. The trial that followed shook Georgia. Emin Moss, the father, accepted a plea deal. He admitted his role in failing to protect his daughter and disposing of her body. In exchange, he received life in prison without parole. His testimony would later be used against Tiffany. But Tiffany Moss, she showed no remorse. She represented herself in court, refusing even to hire an attorney. Her demeanor was chilling. She sat silently through most of the proceedings, barely reacting as prosecutors laid out the evidence. Photographs of Imani's frail body, testimony from doctors about starvation, recordings of her husband describing Tiffany's control. At one point, the prosecutor said, "This child weighed just 32 pounds, 32. She was starved to death in her own home." The courtroom was silent, except for muffled sobs from those who listened. Victim impact statements poured heartbreak into the room. Teachers spoke of the little girl who smiled through pain. Relatives who had been shut out of her life spoke of regret, of the what-ifs that would haunt them forever. Tiffany offered no apology. No defense, no words, only cold silence. And that silence cut deeper than any confession. On April 29, 2019, Tiffany Moss was convicted of the murder of her stepdaughter, Imani. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection, the first woman in Georgia in nearly 50 years to receive such a sentence. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some felt relief. Others felt sorrow. Justice had been served, but it came too late for a little girl who had spent her last days locked away and starving. Family members described their pain in raw words. She was only 10. She had so much life ahead of her, and instead of being loved, she was left to waste away. The community, too, was shaken. Vigils were held. Teachers lit candles for the student they had lost. Neighbors questioned how they could have missed the signs. Everyone was left with the same haunting thought. Could this have been stopped? As for Tiffany, she remains on death row, appealing her sentence but facing the slow, inevitable weight of justice. The tragedy of Imani Moss is more than a crime story. It is the story of a child erased by silence. Silence from her stepmother, who ignored her cries. Silence from her father, who failed to protect her. Silence from a system that didn't act soon enough. And in that silence, a little girl's life slipped away. For those who knew her, the memories remain. A shy smile, a love for drawing, a child who wanted nothing more than love and belonging. Now, all that remains is her absence, a hole that no sentence, no punishment, can ever truly fill. Imani Moss weighed just 32 pounds when she died, her body consumed by hunger, her spirit broken by neglect. But as horrifying as Imani's silence was, the next case reveals a crime even louder in its cruelty. In a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri, police officers approached a small pink bungalow. The blinds were drawn, the house was silent, but on Facebook, a post had appeared just hours earlier, shocking, vulgar, and impossible to ignore. That bitch is dead. When officers entered the home, they found Claudine D.D. Blanchard, 48 years old, lying in her bed. A violent slash across her back, blood soaking through the sheets. She was dead. At first it looked like a brutal home invasion, but soon investigators uncovered a darker truth. Dee murder wasn't just about violence, it was about years of secrets, manipulation, and a daughter who had been living a lie. For nearly 2 decades, Dee convinced the world her daughter, Gypsy Rose, was terminally ill, wheelchair-bound, weak, a child with leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures. Doctors, charities, even celebrities believed it. Millions of dollars poured in, sympathy cards stacked up. Their community called her a devoted mother. But behind closed doors, Gypsy wasn't sick at all. She was a prisoner in her own home, her hair shaved, her teeth pulled, her childhood stolen, and when the truth could no longer be contained, it ended in blood. Springfield, Missouri, 2015, the Blanchard's house stood out on the block. Painted pink by Habitat for Humanity, built by donations filled with medical supplies, stuffed animals, and hospital beds. Neighbors saw a fragile young girl and her saintly mother, fighting the battle of a lifetime against disease. But what they didn't see was the control. Dee Blanchard appeared to be an angel. Heavy-set, soft-spoken, often dressed in pastel colors. To doctors, she was a devoted mother with folders of medical records, rattling off symptoms with precision. To neighbors, she was a selfless caregiver who sacrificed everything for her daughter. But to Gypsy Rose, Dee was a captor. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born in 1991. As a child, she was healthy, but Dee began spinning stories early. Seizures, developmental delays, life-threatening conditions. By the time Gypsy was 7, she was in a wheelchair. At 8, she had a feeding tube. Her teeth were pulled. Surgeries piled up. Gypsy grew up believing she was dying, that she would never live a normal life, that she needed her mother for every breath. Yet as she entered her teens, cracks began to show. She could walk when no one was watching. She could think for herself, question the endless pills and procedures, and with those cracks came rage. Dee suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychiatric disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent for attention and sympathy. For Dee, the role of devoted mother gave her identity. It gave her money, housing, trips to Disney, charity checks from strangers. But more than that, it gave her power. Every time Gypsy questioned her illnesses, Dee reminded her, "Without me, you'd die." It wasn't just manipulation, it was control. Physical, emotional, psychological. And for Gypsy, the only way out seemed unthinkable. By 2015, Gypsy was 23 years old. She had secretly connected with people online, searching for friendship, love, escape. That's where she met Nicholas Gaudijon, a man with his own troubled past. Their messages turned from flirtation to fantasy to planning to something darker. Gypsy confided in Nicholas about the abuse, about the wheelchair she didn't need, about the medical lies, about the years of suffering, and together they devised a plan. On the night of June 14, 2015, Nicholas traveled to Springfield. Gypsy let him into the home while Dee Dee slept. The house was silent except for the hum of an oxygen machine Dee Dee didn't need. Gypsy handed Nicholas a knife. Moments later, Dee Dee lay in her bed, her body torn open by stab wounds. The woman the world thought of as a saint had died in the very place she felt safest. Gypsy hid in the bathroom, covering her ears as her mother was killed. It was brutal. It was intimate. It was the end of a life built on lies. The next morning, neighbors grew worried. They saw the strange Facebook posts from Dee Dee's account. They called police. Inside the house, investigators found Dee Dee's body, but Gypsy's wheelchair was still there. Her medications were still there. Her clothes were still there. It looked like a kidnapping. A sick child taken from her dead mother's home. The community panicked. Social media exploded with fear and grief. Where was Gypsy Rose? But within days, police traced Gypsy's online activity. They tracked her to Wisconsin, where she and Nicholas were hiding. When they arrived, the truth hit like a bombshell. Gypsy walked. Without crutches, without help. For the first time, the world saw her as she truly was. Healthy, capable, and free of the illnesses Dee Dee had spent years inventing. Neighbors gasped. Reporters scrambled. The story of the kidnapped sick girl had transformed into something darker. The story of a daughter who conspired to kill her own mother. The trial captured international attention. On one side was the gruesome fact. Gypsy had helped orchestrate her mother's murder. On the other was the unshakable truth. Gypsy was a victim herself, a young woman who had been caged by lies her entire life. Prosecutors showed the crime scene. Dee Dee's bloodied body, the knife, the Facebook post. They presented Nicholas Godejohn as the killer, but emphasized Gypsy's role in planning it. But Gypsy's defense was clear. Years of psychological torture, unnecessary surgeries, fabricated illnesses, stolen childhood. They painted Dee Dee not as a victim, but as an abuser whose death was the desperate breaking point of her daughter. In 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison for second-degree murder. Nicholas Godejohn, tried separately, received life in prison. In the courtroom, Gypsy spoke softly. "I didn't want her dead. I just wanted to be free." The words silenced the room. The sentences left the public divided. Some saw Gypsy as a cold-blooded killer. Others saw her as a victim, punished for the crime that freed her from years of abuse. In interviews, Gypsy has expressed both relief and regret. Relief to finally live as herself. Regret that her mother's life ended in violence. For Dee Dee's family, the grief is tangled. They mourn her death, but also struggle with the knowledge of the lies she spun. Her own father once said, "She got what was coming." The community remains haunted. Neighbors replay their memories of the smiling mother and daughter in the pink house. They ask themselves how they missed the signs. And Gypsy, still behind bars, receives letters of support from strangers who see her as a symbol of survival. Her story has inspired documentaries, dramas, and debates about abuse, control, and justice. The case of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose is more than a story of murder. It is the story of captivity without chains. It forces us to ask, what is justice when the victim is also a perpetrator? When the abuser is also the murdered? Gypsy Rose lost her childhood, her health, her trust. Dee Dee lost her life. And the world lost its illusions about what evil can look like. Because evil doesn't always appear as a monster. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it calls itself mother. In the end, Dee Dee Blanchard built a house of lies. Brick by brick, diagnosis by diagnosis, sympathy by sympathy. But lies can't last forever. When the walls finally collapsed, they left behind a body in a bed, a daughter in prison, and a community asking questions with no simple answers. The haunting truth remains. Gypsy Rose wasn't sick. She was never sick. She was a prisoner, and the only cure her mother would allow was death.